Thank you, Chairman. Can you hear me at the back? I was down there at the start of the session, so hopefully you can hear me. I share with Paul Harris, who I think I saw going out the door, a little bit of hoarseness, again due to FA Cup semi-final disappointment. I'm an Everton fan. Anyway, good morning, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. In the absence of my Secretary-General, Tom Moran, who was with the Minister in China, and Aidan O'Driscoll, who had to attend an important meeting in Brussels, I'm afraid, like Liverpool, you've been left with the third choice. Just quickly, I'm actually relatively new to the area of climate change, having spent the previous 5 years dealing with the food hygiene area, particularly as it relates to Department of Agriculture-approved meat establishments. As well as my own departmental colleagues, I must say I'm grateful to my colleagues in other departments and agencies, many of whom are here today, for their assistance to me since I came into the division, and I appreciate their patience with me as I've tried to absorb this fascinating, vital and very technical area, which deals with one of the most important areas for the future of this country and of the world. The current phase of public consultation on Irish climate policy development, which has been facilitated by the Department of the Environment, provides a welcome opportunity for policymakers and for government to consider suggestions and options from stakeholders on how best to address Ireland's climate change obligations and commitments to 2020 and beyond. Agriculture, land use and forestry have very significant roles to play in shaping this policy. My department is very grateful to the Institute for this opportunity to set out our thoughts and our current policies on agriculture, land use and forestry as they relate to the further development of national climate policy. In considering climate policy development, we must of course keep in mind the current and planned EU and international commitments around emission reduction expectations and targets. These will be vital in shaping national climate policy, as these targets will ultimately need to be achieved in the short, in the medium and in the long term, not just to 2020, but beyond to 2050 and even further. National policy on climate change must therefore reflect these very real targets. The work currently being undertaken by the Secretariat of the National Economic and Social Council, in consultation with the various stakeholders, is very important to inform government decisions in this regard. Officials of my department, including my division, have already had detailed discussions with NESC as part of this consultation process. Sustainable national climate policies must balance achievement of targets from the EU and international dimension with the very equally important national policy concerns of economic recovery, human well-being and rural development. Sustainability is all about balance in social, economic and environmental terms. I'm aware from me down the back you may not be able to see the detail of this, but essentially it's just a snapshot of agriculture as it stands in Ireland today. 4.2 million hectares in total under agricultural land. 90% of that is grassland, and most of it under permanent pasture. Roughly 10% under crops. Separately, there are 0.75 million hectares of forestry. In terms of livestock, we have 6.6 million cattle, broken down between 1.1 million dairy cows, 1.1 million beef cows, 4.26 million other cattle. Sheep and pigs, 4.7 million and 1.5 million respectively. Now, in economic terms, as of June 2011, and there may be more recent figures available, but agri-food contributed 6.2% gross value added. It contributes 7.5% of the total employment in the economy, and last year represented 9.8% of total exports. Agriculture continues to be a key indigenous sector in the economy, with our agri-food exports approaching 9 billion in 2011, which was somewhat ahead of what was forecast. There are significant economic, environmental, employment and rural developments continuing to accrue from the sector in Ireland. And these are set to expand further, as has already been pointed out, with the rollout of Food Harvest 2020, reform of the Common Agricultural Policy post-2013, possible opening of new markets, and the lifting, of course, of the milk quota restrictions in 2015. Irish farmers are very conscious that they are the custodians of the Irish countryside for future generations. Agriculture and forestry are the dominant land uses in Ireland, accounting for more than 70% of the national territory. As I've said, Minister Coveney is currently leading a trade mission to China, where he is stressing the importance of sustainable intensification of agriculture to meet the challenge of food security. In particular, the Minister will highlight the strengths that underpin Ireland's green image, our environmentally friendly, grass-based production system, and the level of knowledge, expertise, quality control and environmental skill sets that are possessed by our primary producers, our farmers. Worldwide, the human population is set to rise by 2 billion to 9 billion by 2050. Ireland currently produces enough food to feed a human population of over 30 million per annum. We export, therefore, up to 85% of our agricultural output. And this has happened for decades, much earlier than the generally applied 1990 climate accounting base year. Food exports have been the dominant feature and the fundamental basis of the Irish agricultural sector. The continuation of a joined-up approach which features sustainable growth, allied to smarter, greener agricultural systems, is key to the continued expansion of the sector. The benefits include achieving economies of scale, lower carbon footprints on a per unit of production basis, and progressive protection of the environment when the system is well managed and monitored. Food Harvest 2020 sets out the vision and ambition for the Irish agriculture, fisheries and forestry sectors, and it envisages significant expansion both in volume and value terms for the relevant sectors through to 2020. The strategy is based on the three key themes of smart green growth. Smart in the sense of embracing innovation, new technologies and improving cost competitiveness. Green in the sense of clearly demonstrating and capitalising on Ireland's environmental credentials. Growth in the sense of efficient and environmentally sustainable production that delivers growth in primary output by 1/3 and around a 40% increase in value added and exports. So the main targets are to increase primary output by 1.5 billion, the increase in value added by 40% compared to 2008, and achievement of an export target of 12 billion for the sector by 2020. As I've said, it is already just under 9 billion as of the end of last year. Food Harvest confirms that the achievement of environmental sustainability is no longer merely considered in a context of constraint on agricultural production. Rather, sustainability is central to the strategy that will deliver growth and added value to Irish produce. The productive outputs of the expansion envisaged in Food Harvest 2020 will be manifest in the supply of high-quality produce with some of the lowest carbon footprints anywhere in the world. As I've said, it is already providing a significant contribution to the national economic recovery and a stimulus to employment and rural development. Industry has the major role in implementation of the recommendations in the strategy, while a high-level committee chaired by the Minister drives the state's involvement and oversees the overall development of the sector. An independent consultant has recently been appointed to carry out an environmental analysis of the scenarios that are raised from achievement of the targets in Food Harvest. This consultant is to deliver an interim report by the end of July, with the final environmental analysis report to be presented to the high-level committee by the end of October 2012. Again, some of this will be very familiar to you, so I won't dwell too long on it, but at 26%, Ireland is way over the EU average of 9% from the point of view of greenhouse gas emissions from the agriculture sector. And when you exclude non-ETS, when you exclude ETS, I beg your pardon, Ireland has more than 2.5 times the EU average. Seen here in blue, Ireland up there. And this proportion, again, as we've seen from the EPA's predictions, is likely to rise towards 50% of the non-ETS sector in the years ahead, as emissions associated with the likes of energy decline. This is a somewhat unique profile, not just in the EU, but in the developed world, and really only New Zealand has a similar agricultural profile in terms of emissions. They have a similar small population and a similar agricultural spread. But this highlights the need in setting targets to take the proportion of emissions from agriculture into account. And this was not done in setting targets for the current ESD. Two quick slides to show you the sectoral profile, and this one shows the breakdown of agricultural emissions as a percentage by activity. 56% coming from non-dairy cattle, 22% from dairy cattle. The remainder made up very small numbers from pigs, 7% from sheep, and then the 13% of fertilizer use. And a further analysis would show that enteric fermentation in general is responsible for 50%. Manure management between slurry storage and manure storage is 14%, and then the remainder coming from agricultural soils. Compared to the EU, emissions from Irish soils are in fact much lower than other countries due to the high proportion of cropland in those countries and a focus on an intensive feeding system rather than our grass-based ruminant production system. The department has explored a number of mitigation options based on the uptake of cost-effective technologies. In our most recent detailed analysis, the department estimates that potential for mitigation through these measures is of the order of 3 to 4% compared to business as usual. Teagasc has carried out further detailed analysis over the past year or so, and we understand this will be presented to NESC as part of the stakeholder consultation in coming weeks. The department's analysis is broadly in line with analysis carried out by IIEA in 2010 and with last year's EU Commission 2050 roadmap, which recognised that mitigation potential in agriculture is much lower than in the energy sector, and that in fact much of it has already been achieved. However, progress has certainly been seen over the past 20 years or so in terms of improved efficiency, steady reductions in emissions, compared with basically maintaining overall production levels. The EU Commission's JRC report, Greenhouse Gas Emissions from European Livestock Systems, compared production from all the major livestock commodities in Europe from a life cycle analysis perspective. And it is clear that for beef, for beef and for milk, Ireland is one of the most efficient producers in Europe, especially when the impacts on ecosystem carbon are considered. Here, just to point out to you, this is Ireland with a very, you can probably definitely can't see this little bit of blue here, representing CO2 from LULUCF2, and you can see the comparison with some of the other member states. The JRC report also compared production in European countries to beef from Brazil and lamb produced in New Zealand. This comparison confirmed Ireland's superior performance in terms of emissions per unit of product. The JRC findings have been confirmed by an FAO report, which carried out a detailed study of emissions associated with milk production from various different systems around the world. And that analysis shows that temperate grassland production systems are the most efficient in the world. Both of these reports represent an external international verification of Ireland's own analysis that our milk and beef production systems are among the most efficient in the world. It is therefore vital that in determining national policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, there is a need to ensure that measures do not cause carbon leakage. Turning to the forest sector, at an EU level, it is estimated that forests remove about 9% of greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere. The contribution varies across the Union. In Ireland's case, afforestation since 1990 is a significant and growing carbon sink. By 2020, this component of the forest sector is expected to remove close on 5 million tonnes of carbon dioxide per annum from the atmosphere. Government policy is to continue to expand forest cover in order to further realise and sustain the contribution of the forest sector to mitigation through sequestration in vegetation and soils, storage and harvested wood products, and through the substitution of fossil fuels by forest-based biomass. There has been some discussion earlier on land use change and forestry. And in relation to this, an important decision was adopted in Durban on new international rules for forestry carbon accounting, which were quite welcome in general terms to Ireland. The EU Commission has followed this with its recently published proposal for new rules relating to emissions and removals from LULUCF. Now, Ireland's view is that the ability to utilise the climate change mitigation afforded from Irish forests and forest products and the role of forest-based biomass in substituting for fossil and fuel is vital to contribute to climate change mitigation policy to 2020 and beyond. The forest sector contribution to mitigation takes place over several decades. This must be underpinned by national policies and measures across afforestation, materials use and renewable energy policy. The current Commission proposal on LULUCF aims to establish a separate framework which would not be used in the setting of or compliance with targets up to 2020, up to the 20% level already agreed by the EU under the ESD. Now, this is one of the matters that Ireland has raised as one of quite a number in relation to the proposal. I would like to briefly touch on bioenergy and apprise you of recent developments. As you will be aware, Ireland's target is to reach 16% of energy from renewable sources by 2020, and later speakers will no doubt cover this important issue in much more detail from a national perspective. As for the Department of Agriculture, the Department introduced its bioenergy scheme in 2007 as a pilot exchequer-funded scheme, and this was then followed by an EU co-funded scheme under the Rural Development Programme. The scheme provides 50% grant aid of the establishment costs of crops to a maximum of 1,300 per hectare, I should say. Under an amendment to the scheme introduced late last year following a review of its workings, participants are no longer required to maintain the crop for 7 years as a condition of receiving grant aid. The recently introduced refit tariffs for biomass, taken together with the removal of the 7-year obligation, we expect will result in an increase in the number of growers who will be attracted to growing energy crops, as more certainty appears in terms of the availability of long-term contracts from end users. The current 2012 scheme has seen quite an increase in terms of the area, from a very low base, admittedly, for which applications for grants have been made. And we estimate that in the region of 420 hectares in total will be planted under the 2012 scheme, compared with just 224 in 2011 and 353 in 2010. Interestingly, the balance has shifted from miscanthus being in the ascendancy over willow in the early years. It's gone the other way around, and there are much more, there's not quite 2 to 1 applications for planting of willow compared to miscanthus. In terms of development of bioenergy policy, officials from my department and from the Department of the Communications, Energy and Natural Resources, along with Teagasc and the SEAI, are currently examining this area of bioenergy. We will take particular account of the various strands of bioenergy that are within the agriculture sector, including forestry, energy crops, anaerobic digestion, as well as the use of tallow and meat and bone meal for energy production. Minister Rabbitte plans to publish a national renewable energy plan by end of 2012, and the study on bioenergy being carried out in the interim will be very important in informing this strategy. I think Geraldine mentioned earlier, do we want to be leaders or followers? Well, in terms of research, there is no doubt that Ireland is to the forefront in research aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. Ireland is a founder member of the Global Research Alliance on Agricultural GHG Emissions, whose objective is to pool the resources of like-minded countries to enable the agriculture sector to continue to reduce emissions. The work of this alliance is based on 3 main groups: livestock, crops and rice, Teagasc representing Ireland on livestock and crops research groups. Ireland is engaged with the EU's Joint Programming Initiative on Agriculture, Food Security and Climate Change. Again, the Department and Teagasc represent Ireland on the governing board of this initiative. During 2005 to 2008, the Department made awards totalling more than €15 million on climate change-related projects under the Research Stimulus Fund. Funding was provided in 2011 in the order of €1.7 million for a project entitled Gaseous Emissions agriculture and land use network. The main focus of funding is to improve our understanding of carbon stock changes in agricultural soils in order to contribute to the development of a more robust inventory and underpin future accounting for these categories. Following the 2011 report entitled Stimulating Sustainable Agricultural Production Through Research and Innovation, another RSF call for proposals was launched last December. A unique feature of this call is the link between production research and gaseous emissions research, which will mainstream environmental research into the agricultural research agenda. A number of proposals have been received on foot at this call, and these will be evaluated in the coming months. Last month, Ireland became a founding member with France and the Netherlands of the new United Nations FAO partnership on benchmarking and monitoring the environmental performance of livestock supply chains. In the next 3 years, this partnership will develop sector-specific guidelines for assessment of greenhouse gas emissions along main livestock supply chains, a global database on greenhouse gas emissions associated with the production of feed crop materials, and a set of methods for assessment of wider environmental performance assessment of livestock supply chains. Clearly, Ireland is deeply committed and is a leader in terms of research that is aimed at improving parameters of production, environment and socio-economics. It is vital that the results of this research are implemented with the help of our stakeholders in agri-food so that we can guarantee the supply of sustainable food into the future. The fundamental basis for work on climate change is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Again, you will be familiar with Article 2, which sets out its principal objective: stabilisation of atmospheric levels of greenhouse gases. But it continues, such a level should be achieved in a time frame sufficient to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally to climate change, to ensure that food production is not threatened, and to enable economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. Food production is at the heart of the global climate effort under UNFCCC, and Irish agriculture is above all about sustainable production of food. In national policy formulation, therefore, our decisions should be informed by our well-earned world reputation and our proven past performance as one of the most efficient food production countries. The Irish agri-food sector must continue to produce food more efficiently in carbon terms. National climate policy should support and enhance that effort. In terms of adaptation, again, as has been said earlier, Ireland understands that agriculture must adapt to climate change. There is a need to take actions in the agriculture sector in terms of adaptation so as to ensure that food production is not threatened in the medium and long terms. There is not a lot of understanding about how agriculture production in Ireland will in fact adapt to climate change, but generally it is believed it will actually be benign or positive. However, we have a responsibility to take actions to ensure that we are positioned to react positively to any beneficial impacts through increased output, particularly in the face of increasing world demand for food and likely negative climate impacts in other parts of the world. Ireland must work to understand the likely impacts of climate change on our agri-food economy, and making provision for adaptation must be part of our national thinking into the future. It is fair to say that most of Ireland's efforts to date in relation to climate change have been focused on mitigation. We now must give much more consideration to adaptation, so as to be in a position to define the strategies for the sector. Ireland has, however, already made significant contribution to the worldwide efforts to understand the twin concepts that are mitigation and adaptation through its leading role in the UNFCCC. In this regard, Ireland has in particular been one of the strongest supporters for a work programme on agriculture. Progress is slow. As I say, since I came into this job, I'm baffled at how long it takes to progress a sentence or a paragraph at UN level. But progress was made in Durban when it was agreed to ask the subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice of the UN, SUBSTA, to consider issues related to agriculture. So agriculture was extracted and out on its own to consider issues related to agriculture at its 36th session, with the aim of exchanging views at the Conference of Parties in Qatar adopting a decision on this matter at its next session in December. Ireland has already been prominent in contributing to the EU submission to SBSTA, and again I thank my colleagues in the Department of the Environment and in the EPA for this, in Teagasc for their input here. And the Irish submission to the EU and in turn the EU submission to SBSTA have been sent earlier this year. We are hoping that SBSTA will be in a position after its deliberations to actually make a recommendation to the next COP for a separate UNFCCC work programme on agriculture. Since the 1990s, emissions from the agriculture sector have been falling slowly but steadily. At the same time, outputs from the sector have been increasing, giving rise to the low carbon intensity of Irish food. Sustainable intensification of agricultural production, making better use of the land by producing more food and at the same time reducing the emissions per unit of food produced is what Irish agriculture does best. Currently, afforestation that has been carried out since 1990 is counted for the purpose of national compliance with Kyoto targets for the period to 2012. The agreements at Durban would allow the forest sector to continue to be counted for compliance purposes. The recent EU Commission proposals would not appear to provide for this. Irrespective of the outcome of this process, the acknowledged role of forests in climate change mitigation must be factored into national and EU-wide policies and measures in the period up to and beyond 2020. We are one of the least forested countries in Europe, but we have embarked upon a vigorous afforestation expansion programme in recent decades. Our forest cover is now at a creditable 11%, which is up from 7%. Ireland sees a number of very important issues in the Commission proposals on LULUCF. Again, the Departments of Agriculture, Departments of Agriculture and the Environment and the EPA have already been working closely to prepare Ireland's detailed response to the Commission on its proposals. Discussions on these proposals are at a very early stage and are likely to continue for many months ahead before they are finalised. Regarding the ambitious targets in Food Harvest 2020, the aim is that agriculture emissions will be contained through utilising existing best practice and further developing high-efficiency farm practices and methods. The emissions reduction potential in agriculture, not just in Ireland but worldwide, is limited. However, the Department of Agriculture recognises the key roles of continued research and the need to realise greater efficiencies at farm level. In spite of these very challenging economic times, the Department of Agriculture has continued to support extensive research programmes at national, EU and international levels. For many, many years, Ireland has been to the fore in the EU and on international stages in presenting the case for sustainable agri-food production, particularly as practiced in the Irish context, as a key to future food security. These efforts at UNFCCC, FAO and EU levels are seeing results. It is vital that national legislation supports this process. Thank you.